Hey, good evening, everybody. It's KB5MIQ Big Boy. We're going to do part two of the tech question pool, cover two or three more subsections of the question pool on tech. So let's get into it. Group TOC, RF hazards, radiation exposure, proximity to antennas, recognize safe power levels, exposures to others, radiation types, and duty cycle. What types of radiation are VHF and UHF radio signals? A. Gamma radiation. Hey, ham radio cat. B. Ionizing radiation. C. Alpha radiation. D. Non ionizing radiation. And the answer is D. Non ionizing radiation. Which of the following frequencies has the lowest value for maximum permissible exposure limit, 50 megahertz? The first answer is A, 3.5 megahertz, B, 50 megahertz, C, 440 megahertz, D, 1296 megahertz. 50 megahertz is the answer. Honestly, I don't know why they picked that one. I'd have to do a little more research, but that's the answer on that one's 50. What is the maximum power level that an amateur radio station may use at a VHF frequency before an RF exposure evaluation is required? A. 1500 watts PEP transmitter output. B. 1 watt forward power. D. 50 watts PEP at the antenna. D. 50 watts PEP reflected power. The answer is C. 50 watts PEP at the antenna. What factors affect the RF exposure of people near an amateur radio station? Frequency and power level of the RF field, distance from the antenna to a person, radiation pattern of an antenna. All of the choices are correct. It's kind of odd how that comes out. Just throw this in as an offshoot. I do know that distance from the antenna to the person has a big factor in it. But I carried a backpack radio in the Army as a grunt with the antenna right here behind my head for several years, and those operated in the high 40s, 50 megahertz range. So, in FM, but they weren't but like 2 to 5 watt radios. But that's just interesting to me. What do exposure limits? Why do exposure limits vary with frequency? A. Lower frequency RF fields have more energy than higher frequency fields. B. Lower frequency RF fields do not penetrate the human body. C. Higher frequency RF fields are transient in nature. D. The human body absorbs more RF energy at some frequencies than at others. Which of the following is acceptable method to determine that your station complies with FCC exposure regulations? By calculation based on FCC OET Bulletin 65, by calculation based on computer modeling, by measure of field strength using calibrated equipment. D, all of these choices are correct, and the answer is D, all of the choices are correct. What could happen if a person accidentally touched your antenna while you were transmitting? A, touching the antenna could cause television interference. B, they might receive a painful RF burn. C, they might develop radiation poisoning. D, all the choices are correct. The answer is B. There's a possibility they could get a painful RF burn, especially if you run an amplifier. Which of the following actions might prevent amateur radio operators? Which of the following actions might amateur radio operators take to prevent exposure to RF radiation in excess of FCC supplied limits? A, relocate antennas. B, relocate the transmitter. C, increase the duty cycle. D, all the choices are correct. A is relocate the antenna. So it's pretty simple. I don't remember a lot of this RF radiation questions when I got my novice ticket years ago, but you need to be as far away from the antennas as feasibly possible. You know, if you're ham radio cat, if you're running 150 foot of coax, that's from your shack to the antenna, my personal opinion, you're probably all right. How can you make sure your station stays within compliance with RF safety regulations? by informing of the FCC of any changes made in your station. B, by reevaluating the station whenever an item of equipment is changed. Hey, ham radio cat. Aaron, old buddy. Yeah, ham radio cat's in here. C, making sure your antennas have a low SWR. D, all the choices are correct. The answer is B, by reevaluating the station whenever an item of equipment is changed, like if you bought a different transmitter or whatever. What is a duty cycle? What is duty cycle? Why is duty cycle one of the factors used to determine safe RF radiation exposure levels? A, it affects the average exposure of people to radiation. B, it affects the peak exposure of people to radiation. C, it takes into account the antenna feed line loss. D, it takes into account the thermal effects of the final amplifier. The answer is A, it affects the average exposure of people to radiation. What is the definition of duty cycle during the averaging time for RF exposure? The difference between the lowest power output and the highest power output of the transmitter. The difference between PEP and average power output of the transmitter. The percentage of time that a transmitter is transmitting. D, the percentage of time a transmitter is not transmitting. The answer is C. The percentage of time the transmitter is transmitting, and that's going to be how you're going to get your RF exposure is while you're transmitting, not in receiving. How does RF radiation differ from ionizing radiation? RF radiation does not have sufficient energy to cause genetic damage. B, RF radiation can only be detected with an RF dosimeter. C, RF radiation is limited in range to a few feet. D, RF radiation is perfectly safe. The answer is A. RF radiation does not have sufficient energy to cause genetic damage. If the averaging time for exposure is 6 minutes, how much power density is permitted if the signal is present for 3 minutes and absent for 3 minutes, than being present for the entire 6 minutes? A, 3 times as such. B, half as much. D, 2 times as such. There is no adjustment for shorter exposure times. Answer C, 2 times as much. That's the section on RF radiation. There's a lot of questions there that if you're really interested in that and you go out to make sure you got a safe station, dig into it a little further. But also, those are questions you're probably just going to have to memorize answers on. FCC rules, descriptions, and definitions for the amateur radio service operator station license responsibilities. Which of the following is a purpose of the amateur radio service as stated in FCC rules and regulations? Providing personal radio communications for as many citizens as possible. Providing communications for international nonprofit organizations. C, advancing skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. D, all of the choices are correct. The answer is C, advancing skills in the technical and communication phase of the radio art. Which agency regulates and enforces the rules for amateur radio service in the United States? A is FEMA. B, Homeland Security. C, the FCC. D, all the choices are correct. The answer is C, FCC. What are the FCC rules regarding the use of phonetic alphabet for station identification in amateur radio service? A, it is required when transmitting emergency messages. B, it is prohibited. C, it is required when in contact with foreign stations. D, it is encouraged. It's not a requirement. I made a video about that. Depending on your accent and your call and who you're talking to, like my call, KB5MIQ. If I say Kilo Bravo 5, Mike, India, Quebec, for some reason, a lot of people think I'm saying India, Quebec. I'm saying Ike, India, Quebec, and they come back IIQ. Personally, I'll use an abbreviated version of it. I either go Kilowatt Bravo 5, Mexico, India, Quebec, or Kilo Bravo 5, Mexico, India, Quebec, and that has my best effect with it. But it's not a rule, but it's encouraged. How many operator primary station license grants may be held by any one person? A, 1. B, no more than 2. C, 1 for each band on which the person plans to operate. D, 1 for each permanent station location where the person plans to operate. 1. You only have one license. Answer is A, 1. What is proof of possession of an FCC issued operator primary license grant? A printed operator primary station license issued by the FCC must be displayed at the transmitter site, A. B. The control operator must have an operator primary station license in his or her possession when control of the transmitter. C. The control operator primary station licensee must appear in the FCC ULS Consolidated Licensee Database. D. All the choices are correct. The answer is C. The control operator's primary station license must appear in the FCC Universal License Consolidated Database. What is FCC Part 97 definition of a beacon? A government transmitter marking the amateur radio band edges, a bulletin sent by the FCC to announce a national emergency. C. An amateur station transmitting communication for the purpose of observing propaganda or related experimental activities. D. A continuous transmission of weather information authorized in the amateur bands by the National Weather Service. The answer is C. The definition of a beacon is an amateur station transmitting communications for the purpose of observing propagation or related experimental activities. What is the FCC Part 97 definition of a space station? A. Any satellite orbiting the Earth. B. A manned satellite orbiting the Earth. C. An amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. D. An amateur station using amateur radio satellites for the relay of signals. The answer is C. The definition of a space station is an amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Which of the following entities recommends transmit and receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations? A. Frequency Spectrum Manager appointed by the FCC. B. Volunteer Frequency Coordinator recognized by local amateurs. C. FCC Regional Field Office. D. International Telecommunications Union. The answer is B. Volunteer Frequency Coordinator recognized by local amateurs. Who selects a frequency coordinator? A. The FCC Office of Spectrum Management and Coordination Policy. B. The local chapter of National Council of Independent Frequency Coordinators. C. Amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be repeater or auxiliary stations. D. FCC Regional Field Office. Answer is C. Who selects a frequency coordinator? Amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be repeater or auxiliary stations. Which of the following describes the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, RACES? A. A radio service using amateur frequencies for emergency management or civil defense communications. B. A radio service using amateur stations for emergency management or civil. That's the same answer. A radio service using amateur stations. The first was amateur frequencies. This is amateur stations for emergency management or civil defense communications. C. An emergency service using amateur operators certified by civil defense organization as being enrolled in that organization. D. All of the choices are correct. All of those choices are correct. The answer is D. Which following describes RACES? When is willful interference to other amateur radio stations permitted? A. To stop another amateur station which is breaking the FCC rules. B. At no time. C. When making short test transmissions. D. At any time stations in the amateur radio service are not protected from willful interference. The answer is B. At no time do you do willful interference. Okay, we're going to try to cover one more. Authorized frequencies, frequency allocations, emission modes, etc. What is the International Telecommunications Union? An agency of the United States Department of Telecommunications Management. B, a United Nations Agency for Information and Communication Technology Issues. C, an independent frequency coordination agency. D, a department of the FCC. Answer is B, a United Nations Agency for Information and Communications Technology Issues. Which amateur radio stations may make contact with an amateur radio station on the International Space Station using 2 meter and 70 centimeter band frequencies? A, only members of amateur radio clubs at NASA facilities. B, any amateur holding a technician or higher class license. C, only astronauts' family who are hams. D, contacts with ISS are not permitted on amateur radio frequencies. The answer is B. Any amateur holding a tech or higher class license can communicate on those frequencies to the ISS. Which frequency is within the 6 meter band? A, 49 megahertz, B, 52.525, C, 28.5, D, 222.15 megahertz. The answer is B, 52.525. Which amateur band are you using when your station is transmitting on 146.52 megahertz? A, 2 meter band, B, 20 meter band, C, 14 meter band, D, 6 meter band. The answer is A, 2 meter band. What is the limitations for emissions on the frequencies between 219 and 220 megahertz? A, spread spectrum only. B, fixed digital message forward systems only. C, emergency traffic only. D, fast scan television only. Answer is B, fixed digital message forwarding systems only. On which HF band does a technician class operator have phone privileges? A, none. B, 10 meter band only. C, 80, 40, 15, and 10 meter bands. D, 30 meter band only. The answer is B, 10 meter band only. Phone is 28.3 to 28.5 for novice techs. Which of the following VHF, UHF frequency ranges are limited to CW only? A, 50.0 megahertz, 50.1 megahertz, 144.0 megahertz to 144.1 megahertz. B, 219 megahertz to 220 and 420 to 420.1. C, 902 to 902.1 megahertz. D, all the choices are correct. The answer is A, 50 megahertz, 50.1, 144 to 144.1 are limited to CW only. Which of the following is a result of the fact that the amateur radio service is secondary in all and portions of some amateur bands, such as portions of 70 centimeter band? A, U.S. amateurs may find non-amateur stations in those portions and must avoid interfering with them. B, U.S. amateurs must give foreign amateur stations priority in these portions. C, international communications are not permitted in these portions. D, digital transmissions are not permitted in these portions. The answer is A. U.S. amateurs may find non-amateur stations in these portions and must avoid interfering with them. Why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of an amateur band or subband to allow for calibration error in the transmitter frequency display so that modulation sidebands do not extend beyond the band edge to allow for transmitter frequency drift? D, all the choices are correct. The answer is D, all the choices are correct. So it's good policy to say 3 megahertz away from the band edges at least. Which of the following HF bands have frequencies available to technician class operators for ready and data transmission? A, 10, 12, 17, and 40. B, 10, 15, 40, and 80. C, 30 meter band only. D, 10 meter band only. The answer is D, 10 meter band only. What is the maximum peak envelope power output for a technician class operator using their assigned portion of the HF bands? A, 200 watts, B, 100 watts, C, 50 watts, D, 10 watts. The answer is A, 200 watts. Except for some specific restrictions, what is the maximum peak envelope power output for technician class operators using frequencies above 30 megahertz? A, 50 watts. B, 100 watts. C, 500 watts. D, 1500 watts. Answer is D, 1500 watts. Okay, we covered 3 more subsections of that tonight. We'll do another in a couple, 3 days. Appreciate everybody who subscribed to the channel. I hope these help some guys out, especially if you know a person wanting to take his tech test. Have him look at some of these. We're going to try to do the whole question pool before we stop. Thanks again, everybody who subscribed to the channel. Hope everybody has a great week. It's KB5 MIQ, Big Boy 73.